Hello, everyone. It's great to have you with us. If you're here live, this is the first webinar of 2026, and today we're going to be talking about Measure for Measure. So welcome back. You can see some familiar faces in the attendees list, but if you're new, just to remind you how this works, we've got the great opportunity to chat with a scholar who has worked intensively on a Shakespeare play very recently to produce Oxford World Classics introductions. I'm the general editor for that series. My name's Emma Smith. And today we have got Dr. Emma Whipday to talk about her introduction to Measure for Measure. In doing that, we're building on the work of the New Oxford Shakespeare, a brilliant piece of scholarship in all multi-volumes with all kinds of spin-off work. So if you've got more questions about the play, that's always a place to follow up. That work was led by Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boras, and Gabriel Egan, and we're particularly grateful for Terry Boras, who did the editorial work on Measure for Measure. How this goes is that Emma and I chat for perhaps 45 or 50 minutes, and then we've got 25-ish minutes to take questions. Brilliant. We've already got one question come up. It's great if you can post questions as we go, because if you do wait till the end, we may not get time to get to all of them. But we will try and cover as many of those questions as we can. And as I always say, one of the things we all love about doing this webinar is the range of people who join us. Sometimes people who are super expert in all matters about this play already, and who will make some brilliant comments or questions at the end. We look forward to those. And also, we're equally pleased to have people who don't really know much about it or feel that they're very much beginners. So we start quite gently, without assuming that you know too much, and then move on through that. Emma, I'm sorry, that's an enormously long introduction. Thank you so much for coming to be part of this webinar. As we were just saying before we started, this was part of the very first tranche of the world's classics, and so you were in my absolute first list of people. Why did you choose Measure for Measure?
Measure for Measure is a play I've been obsessed by since I was, I think, 16 or 17. So I started studying it for A level. And I think the way you often do with an A level play, I had to learn so many quotations. I sort of knew it off by heart and inside out. And it was also a play I was asked about. I remember at my Oxford interview when I was interviewing to be an undergraduate. So that memory is sort of burned into my brain. So it was very close to me in that sense, because I've thought about it continually since, but I hadn't officially written on it yet as an academic, as a Shakespeare scholar. And I think I was keen to come back to it and see if things had changed for me in my relationship with it in that time. And also because, and I'm sure we'll come to this, it felt like an extremely timely play at the point you asked me, because it was the way it resonates with questions around Me Too, around consent, coercion, abuses of power, female voices being silenced or not. That those questions just seemed very present in the culture at the point where you got in touch. So yeah, it was a treat and an honor to be asked to come back to this play in this
I'm
context.
so pleased that you did, because looking again at your introduction this afternoon, I was so struck by there are ways this is a play really with its feet in the 17th century, and you write about things that we'll touch on in the conversation. Um, the new reign of James, ideas about. There's a lovely section where you talk about sort of masterless women or headless women, women without, who are not fully under patriarchal control for one reason or another. These are all sort of 17th century things about it. And then there's this whole world where you think, oh, this is a really modern play, which I think is one of its great draws for us. So you said you hadn't written about it then. I mean, you've gone on the work that you're just about to publish. Is that right? Tell us about that.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been I mean, so I had been working on it for a while, but not quite got as far as writing something formally and having it published, because I'd been working for some time on a project on brother-sister relationships, particularly relationships where the brother is standing in for the kind of father as the head of the household. So that's where the headless women material emerged from. So I'd been thinking about it in those terms. Actually, the brother-sister relationships have got subsumed into a larger project on non-normative or non-nuclear families that I'm working on at the moment. So step families, brother-sister households, single mother households, etc., which will be a book appearing soon from a trade press. And then I hope to kind of do even more work on this for a sort of future monograph. But so I had Measure for Measure was always going to be a central play for me in those terms, because the brother-sister relationship is at the heart of it. And the question of what a sister owes her brother and what a brother can ask of his sister and how much authority he does or doesn't have over his sister seemed really resonant to my wider project. So yeah,
Full disclosure, I'm an only child. Do you have siblings?
So I have a half sister and a step brother.
So okay, so you're you're deep in that world. We've jumped ahead because I promised that we started quite simply. Tell us. So let's just go over. This is often the most difficult thing, actually, question I ask, which is sort of basically what is the plot, or what's the scenario where we're in Measure for Measure.
Yes, so the scenario that's sort of at the center of the play is that it's a play structured around a series of substitutions. So the Duke decides he's going to temporarily abdicate his authority and put Angelo in his place while he spies on his subjects. So Angelo is substituted for the Duke. Angelo institutes a series of very strict laws involving sexuality in Vienna, and that includes having premarital sex is punishable by death. And Claudio falls under that law because he's had sex with the woman he's married by private contract. So they promise marriage, they've said they're married privately together, Juliet, but they haven't had it solemnized by the church. She is pregnant, so it's quite visible that they've had premarital sex, what's technically premarital sex. So Claudio falls under the new law. His sister Isabella is about to enter a convent so she's a novice nun and she's about to become a sort of full nun, and she pleads for her brother's life to Angelo, the governor in the Duke's place. And Angelo says, if you have sex with me, I will spare your brother's life. And that's the sort of central dilemma of the play. And then this, shall I do the full plot?
I think that's enough. I think that's enough for now, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so maybe my first question then is that doesn't, it's a comedy, right? I mean, it doesn't sound very funny.
Yes. I mean, I find it a very funny play, but it is a very darkly funny play, and it's often referred to as a problem play or a problem comedy because it falls under the classification of comedy in the kind of first Folio classifications. It ends with a lot of marriages, which is the sort of the typical mark of a Shakespearean comedy. The characters, except for one offstage character, the characters don't die. So there's none of the death associated with the tragedy. So in those sort of quite literal terms, it is straightforwardly a comedy, but it deals with bringing the characters near death. It deals with ethical questions. It deals with rape. Its ending is quite queasy. I think we could say that even for early modern audiences, there's a lot about the ending that's unsatisfying and difficult and discomforting, even more so for contemporary audiences today. All of these things are why critics have kind of struggled with it as a play. And I think a lot of the comedy is about sex. It's kind of bawdy comedy, but there's also an awful lot of disgust for sex. There's sort of a description of sex at one point as fishing in a peculiar river from the male perspective, which is a very horrid image that always sticks in my mind. So there's this sort of the sense of sex and death being coupled together a lot. So yeah, I find it funny, but I do remember the first time I saw a live production as an A-level student, or I think it was a recording of a live production, and the audience kept laughing, and I was slightly bewildered by this. I was sort of thinking, how can you find any of this funny? But the humor is subtle and discomforting, and it kind of, the humor sort of draws the problems to your attention. It's not humor that lets you distract from the problems of this problem play. It's humor that's found in these thorny ethical dilemmas.
Gosh, that's so interesting. It's reminding me that I was in a some kind of online conversation during the pandemic, during lockdown. And I think the prompt for it was this question about whether Shakespeare had written King Lear during a period of plague closing the theatres at the beginning of the 17th century.
Mm.
And on this in this conversation was Professor Carol Rutter, who's a brilliant academic from Warwick, University of Warwick, and Carol just said so brilliantly, the real plague play by Shakespeare is Measure for Measure, and
Yeah.
it was all about, although the illness that keeps being sort of circled around is sort of venereal disease, isn't it? It's sex as and sex causing illness.
Yeah.
It is also, as a big. She was just so great on how it's a model for how an urban plague might spread through sort of intimate connections of one way or another, and it really brought out for me how death and disease is such a cluster of sort of atmospheric cluster around the play.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And this question of is it dangerous to get close to other people? It's proximity and intimacy, something deadly or dangerous. And it's interesting because that's sort of counterpointed by in the way the opposite of a plague play, because the other big anxiety in the play is about the procreation of illegitimate children. So rather than the population going down, there's this sense of the kind of population going up and overspilling. But I think at the same time, I completely agree, underneath it, all this kind of death anxiety is and disease
Yeah,
anxiety.
she was great on how plague, this isn't what we're talking about at all, but how, one of the real dis differences is that plague took young people, is it particularly these young people who are most vulnerable to it,
Yeah.
and that there are apparently demographic spikes post-plague where people try to there's a kind of reproduce, there's a sort of death sex kind of I think that's quite a known demographic thing after lots and lots of traumas.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Before we finish with just this more sort of getting our bearings, kind of, you can see we're both um, straining at the leash to talk more about it. Where does it come in Shakespeare's career? Let's just try and fix it there.
So yes, so we're talking, shortly after the death of Elizabeth. So let's see, yeah, we're kind of we're past the sort of the earlier plays. We're past quite, a decade past Titus
Yeah,
Andronicus.
we're past romantic comedy, aren't we? We've
Yes,
done that. Yeah,
and we're into the kind of the coming up to the, yeah, we're kind of in the middle, would you say, of the big tragedies? I'm trying to pinpoint
yeah,
them in my
exactly.
mind.
So we've had Hamlet, but we
Yeah,
haven't had
yeah,
Lear and Macbeth. We're just
yeah.
sort of teetering on that.
We've had
Yeah.
Othello. So
Mm.
yeah, in that kind of, yeah, which maybe explains some of the generic things we've been touching on. This sort of tragic, yeah, that we're in the tragic phase, and yeah, and those kind of, I think I compare it very briefly in the introduction to those romantic comedies in terms of the number of weddings at the end, but it's just in
Yeah.
such a different mode now. Yeah, that kind of that sense of festival and celebratoriness and joy, I'd say, is maybe lacking. This is not a joyful play.
That's true, isn't it? And I was thinking even about the names. So Claudio and Juliet we've had before,
Mm,
and
yeah.
they're a bit washed up here, aren't they? And by the time they've got to Measure for Measure, they've lost some of their
Yeah,
youthful shine.
and Juliet gets so little stage time as well.
Yeah,
It's really interesting, her kind of the demotion of her and Claudia's love story from a, yeah, the romance taking center stage to being about a tragedy of her potentially losing her husband, which is a kind of recognizable tragedy. But it's just demoted. That's not the main, where the main emotional focus or core of the play is.
that's so interesting because I suppose we would always say that Shakespeare's comedies, or often say that Shakespeare's comedies are organized around women's desires or women's kind of narratives. Um, And do we get that? So, when you identified, what the scenario is, you focused absolutely sort of properly on the terrible bargain, the terrible proposition that
Mm,
Isabella is given. It
mm.
does she function, do you feel, as that the kind of is she a kind of Rosalind for Vienna, or is that too a bit shop soiled?
Yeah, I could definitely see the argument there of Rosalind's kind of cross-dressing freedom Isabella possesses in a different way because of the fact that she's not yet a nun, but she's not under her brother's authority because he's in prison, and she's not under her father's authority because he's dead. So she gets this freedom to move around and speak, at least until that's curtailed by a sexual proposition. But she maybe has, there is a similar sense of freedom to act, and an agency. But I think shop soiled is a good way of putting it, the sense that it very quickly becomes it's such a grubby, murky world she's negotiating. And there's also the fact that her role in it is so continually being sort of prodded by men. So we get Lucio kind of prodding her to go and plead for her brother's life. Lucio is this sort of a semi-clown figure, you could say, but he's also, so he's a customer of all the brothels in the play. So he's this sort of, I suppose, borderline transgressive figure, and he's prodding her. And then as soon as he stops, the Duke starts prodding her in disguise as the friar to behave in particular ways. And she just gradually loses her agency over the course of the play, at least until the final scene, because she's becoming more and more used by other people, even as she fights to not be used by Angelo. And so, I feel she loses some of that delightful freedom.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was thinking about that scene that she rejects Angelo's
Mm.
proposition, doesn't she? And she goes to tell Claudio in prison that this is what she has done, and that of course he, as a loving brother, would not expect her to,
Yeah.
um, perjure herself in such a fundamental way as to accept the bargain. And he, of course, is sort of less convinced, isn't he? And I just saw the play. I don't know if you saw the Royal Shakespeare Company production was just on in the autumn. It was a very, very powerful production. And for the first time, I really thought, oh, okay, when she goes to see Claudio in prison, it's another man persuading, trying to chop
Mm.
logic with her
Yeah.
about how her own autonomy should be, should be set aside because
Yeah.
of what men want. And that Claudio, I hadn't seen before, I felt silly for it really. I hadn't seen before how that scene with Claudio just replays the scene with Angelo, and or in this production it really did. And you just thought, oh, okay, this
Yeah.
is what she gets for it.
That's
You're
also great.
brilliant in the introduction about, I mean, you talk about the sources for the play, and we've talked before on this webinar with different plays about how rare it is for Shakespeare to invent a plot, and how interesting it is to see the ways that he operates within the parameters of the source material. Is he? I think he's the one that makes Isabella a nun, or a novice nun,
Yeah.
isn't he? There are lots of versions of this story where the upright, decent woman is propositioned in this way, and has,
Yeah.
but he cranks that up a bit more.
Yeah.
Why does, or what's the significance, do you think, of her being about to enter the convent?
I think it's really interesting because I think it situates her outside the kind of oh gosh, I can't remember who said but someone used the word term compulsory sexuality or compulsory heterosexuality of Vienna. This sort of sense that every woman's plot relates to men and ends in marriage, which I guess you could to a certain extent say was true of the way that things were represented in early modern England, although of course a large proportion of the population actually remained single, the female population, as various scholars have shown. But I think making her a nun puts her outside of that, and it kind of reinforces the sense that there's something very taboo about what Angelo is asking. But of course, that's further complicated by the fact that in a Protestant early modern England, it wasn't necessarily aspirational to be a nun.
Mm.
So there's a sense that on the one hand, she's sort of, I think Lucia calls her a thing enskied and sainted because she's dedicating her life to God and therefore shouldn't be thought about in these sexual terms, although he is sort of teasing her at the same time. But there's also the fact that the ideal Protestant outcome would be marriage and children rather than the sort of Catholic vision of the nun. So there's already a really interesting tension that Shakespeare's exploiting there. But I think he's also doing something interesting because the earlier versions of his sources, so particularly in sort of Augustine's sermon on writing about the Sermon on the Mount, he gives the example of a husband and wife, where the wife is asked to have sex with a corrupt governor to save her husband's life. And so by following some of the later sources in making it a brother-sister relationship, Shakespeare's kind of drawing attention to the fact that what a husband can ask of a wife becomes sort of quasi-incestuous when a brother asks it of a sister. So Isabella has the line about it's not a kind of incest to take life from thine own sister's shame. But it sort of draws attention as well to the whole question of should any man be able to ask this of any woman? So I think, sorry, that's a lengthy answer, but by making her a nun, it does so much. And it also gives her this sense of agency where she's choosing to situate herself outside this patriarchal society under a matriarchal authority structure, under the authority of the kind of the Reverend Mother of the convent as well.
Yes, and the sisters as well, as opposed to the brother. I hadn't thought of there being a sort of alternative family.
Yes.
That you're right that it's a bit like in the last webinar we were talking about Romeo and Juliet, and we talked a bit about the friar and whether the friar feels like a sort of leftover from a Catholic source, but somehow resonates a bit differently in this Protestant world. Do you think, though, that the criticism of the play, writing and scholarship on the play, has been sort of, as it were, a bit too Protestant in that it's tended to? I feel it's only quite recently that I have seen people writing about Isabella's decision to be a nun as if it could be an active choice rather than either a sort of psychopathology that she can't bear sex or intimacy, so of course she would be a nun, or a sort of historical necessity, she's been kind of shut away and she can't be herself, rather than all that historical work that says if you wanted not to spend all your life pregnant and or not to get an education or to be a scholar or something, that to be a nun was the way that women got this kind of freedom. But there feels to me there's a lot of writing about Measure for Measure, which actually doesn't like Isabella.
Yes, I completely agree. There's this entire critical history of people, even the people who praise her in those terms you mentioned, and it's sort of to do with her prudishness as it's sort of represented, as if a sort of assumption that her refusal of sex with Angelo, instead of stemming from the fact that she does not want to have sex with him or indeed to have sex, is a sort of and turning away of sexuality in a way that's immature, or it's
neurotic,
and a lot has been made of those lines where she says, "Were I under terms of death, the impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies, rather and strip myself to death as to a bed that longing hath been sick for, before she'd yield her body up to shame." And people say, "Oh, that's her kind of sadomasochistic desire coming through. She wants to be whipped. It's kind of she's afraid of her own sexuality," rather than the possibility that she's using this language of sort of yearning and sexuality as a way of expressing her desire for martyrdom as a genuine part of her vocation, rather than having to be coercively forced into sex. Yeah, absolutely.
is the sense that I was thinking that perhaps one of the ways, I don't know how you felt about this when you first studied it. Um, I often encounter people reading or thinking about Measure for Measure
Mm.
who feel that they just don't like the characters.
Yeah.
They don't find anyone to like. And I'm not criticizing that as if that's an unsophisticated. In fact, it's very revealing about
Yeah.
what it is we are looking for or where we put our energies when we take the time to engage with a play that it probably still is quite about character.
Yes.
Is
Yeah.
there do you feel that or do you feel
Oh, that's so interesting.
differently?
Yeah. I was thinking that, yes, in terms Shakespeare is, I feel he's pushing our empathy away to a certain extent in this play, because I was thinking about what you said about the Claudio scene becoming a recapitulation from the Angelo scene in a sense. And I think Cheap by Jowl in their Russian language production did something interesting where they have him physically attack Isabella after Angelo's physically attacked Isabella as a way of making that really visible. And Claudio should be a really sympathetic character because he just loved a woman, wanted to marry her, was waiting for a dowry before the marriage could be solemnized by the church, and she's pregnant, and now he's going to die. Like, that's such an extremely sympathetic, kind of vulnerable setup. And yet he's given this act of attempting to coerce Isabella that sort of pushes away the possibility of sympathy, and the Duke's attempting to help Isabella, but in a way that, and I'm sure we'll get to this, is kind of inherently devious in a way that potentially pushes away sympathy. Angelo's given this kind of almost tragic hero moment of reckoning with his desire for Isabella as a man who's always held himself to be so resistant to desire, and yet he's revealed to have done some unpleasant things in his past and to be immediately willing to coerce Isabella. I feel like every moment that we could sympathize with one of them kind of male quasi protagonists were pushed away. And I guess you could argue the same of Isabella. I personally find her very sympathetic, but I think it's the line when she says, more than our brother is our chastity. I feel like that's the line that critics have kind of fixed on and that tends to push people away, because it seems like such a cruel thing to say, I choose an element of my own virtue over this family member that I should love. But then it sort of raises the question of, why should his life be worth more than hers? And her life is being a nun. And so if she did this thing, she would no longer be able to have the vocation that she's attached to. She would suffer kind of social death, in a sense, in a world that's so attached to female virginity. And sorry, this is a lengthy answer again, but yeah.
No, it's a great answer because it also, it, I mean, one of the things I can't decide which direction to go in. I'm going to go in this direction. One of the things we said was, how this play both seems so historically situated and seems so resonant to our own sort of early 20th century, early 21st century moment. And that, what you just said about Isabella there sort of suggests horribly that we haven't come all that far, that we still have to explain why it is Isabella won't go along with this bargain,
Yeah.
as if in some way the bargain is reasonable, or as if, why wouldn't she? And as you point out, in fact, maybe irrelevantly, I'm not quite sure logically as I say this, but it doesn't work anyway. I mean,
Yes.
Angelo thinks that she has slept with him and he still kills
Yes.
Claudio.
And this is
So
the thing I noticed about the play really late, like really late. It was only, I was doing a conversation with an actor and someone who worked on in schools to kind of around toxic masculinity. So it was a really interesting conversation. And I was just talking to them sort of maybe 4 or 5 years ago and had this moment of, but hang on, it's always presented as the moral dilemma at the heart of the play is Isabella's moral dilemma, and her answer to it is tricky for us, and it makes her potentially dislikable, and which is all true. But the fact that Angelo is always going to kill Claudio, whatever she does, the kind of the logic of the plot undercuts what it seems to be presenting. It seems to be about her moral dilemma, but actually the true moral dilemma of the play is very brief, and it's Angelo's should I give in to the corruption of power? Should I coerce Isabella? Should I kill Claudio? And he decides that very, very quickly. And the decision to kill Claudio anyway, we don't even see it. It's so fast. And so he's always the one with the real agency there and not her. But it's a kind of sleight of hand by Shakespeare. It's such an interesting choice that he doesn't remind us of that. He allows it to seem to have been on her.
And I suppose the Duke, who maybe we should talk about now, I mean, the Duke really leans into that, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So he knows that it is not true. He
Yes.
knows that Claudio, by his own machinations, he knows that Claudio is not in fact dead, but
Mm.
he allows Isabella to continue to think that he is
Yeah.
for reasons not really very clear. I mean,
Yeah.
tell us, let's talk a bit about the Duke. And you began with the Duke as the sort of ultimate substitution or the enabling substitution at the beginning. And I've just been glancing through people's questions as we've been going to get a sense of how the conversation is. And there's a number of people sort of interested, I think, in that sort of political shaping of the play, that there is
Mm.
something about government. That's
Yeah.
how it begins, isn't it? With
Yes.
Aeschylus, the Duke talking to Aeschylus about the arts of government in some slightly odd way.
Yes.
Where do you where do you come down on the Duke's role or how the Duke's presented?
Well, I think the fact that he begins talking about government at the very start of the play is really interesting because I feel that to me is another of the kind of bait and switches that the play does. It's sort of, it's set, that Shakespeare's opening lines almost always set the terms of something that's going to be very big in the play that follows. And this is a very explicit sort of, this is a play about government. But then he doesn't, as you say, it's odd. He doesn't really say much. There are maybe a couple of lines missing there. It doesn't quite make sense, and then it's gone. The moment's gone, and then he's abdicating government. So I feel like the play as a whole does that as well. It's sort of, it is about government. It's about the corrupting effects of power. It's about governors, the extent to which governors should themselves perform the virtues that they're requiring of their subjects. It's about whether you can enact a law if you yourself break it, those kinds of questions. And I suppose about government and delegation. But I feel it's really about maybe this is just my interest in the play, but I feel it's really about intimate relationships, the extent to which the state can or can't act upon intimate relationships and what happens when power corrupt them. It's not about government in this kind of distanced, abstract way that we might expect. And I find it interesting that the Duke is immediately sort of implicitly criticized by the friar after he's given by Friar Thomas after he's given up his government, because he sort of says to him that he had to give up this power because he's failed to enact his own laws, he's failed to live by them, and so and he's also let his subjects not live by them, and so of course now he'd be a tyrant. He uses the word tyrant if he were suddenly to exercise this authority, having enabled them to break those laws. And he uses a lot of metaphors that are very violent, to do with sort of the baby beating the nurse rather than the nurse beating the baby, on the assumption that government is inherently violent and he's not enacting it. And Friar Thomas says, but it was always up to you to perform the authority you were supposed to whenever you chose to. That remains true throughout the play. He could just come back into his position of authority and solve everything, but he doesn't. He does everything in these sort of underground, devious, manipulative ways. And so I suppose that's a thing that the play is asking as well, is it legitimate for a ruler to exert rule illegitimately while also giving away their power in order to bring about a good ending? I think the question of whether government, the ends just justifies the means, is something the play's exploring.
Because really, by the end, all that's been sorted out is the problems that the play itself has generated.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And
it hasn't. It isn't obvious that Angelo's. If you were to argue that Angelo's been put in as the strict ruler who will enforce the laws, and that because the Duke has failed to do that and can't do it, and then he will swing back in and sort of get the credit for it. Angelo will take the electoral disadvantage of it all, and the Duke will have still have the benefit. There isn't a sense, though, is there, that the general state of morality,
Mm.
if that's in any way what the play is about, has changed
No.
by the end of the play, not least because Claudio and Juliet seem like the wrong targets for the crackdown on
Yeah.
morality in the first place,
Yeah.
and because there's this much more skeptical morality about that comes through in that scene, sort of comedy scene in the court when
Yes.
the law just seems to be, foolish, really.
Yeah.
Uh, but
Oh,
the sense that the brothels can't be stopped. This is urban life. This is human life. Will you geld and spay all the youth of the city? Is that how you're going to stop it?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I find that scene you mentioned where sort of Elbow comes in complaining about his wife being, in some sense, misused. It's always completely unclear how, what has occurred. And
hmm.
the whole scene just kind of collapses into chaos. I think
Yeah,
that,
it's not a good start. Is it being called elbow? You're probably not going to get a very good hearing, I think, in
but
a
I think
Shakespeare play.
that's so interesting because of the things you were just saying about the play only solving its own problems, because the solution to all the problems the play ends up offering is we'll make these people into nuclear families. There are illegitimate children, good, we'll make them legitimate children, we'll marry everyone off, then
Mhm.
everything will be sort of safe and contained. And yet so early on we get introduced to Elbow and his wife, where she ends up in a brothel, something happens to her, she's pregnant. Does she also end up having sex in the brothel? There's this sense that even marriage isn't safe from these brothels. And the individual characters of Mistress Overdone, she gets hauled off to jail, and Pompey gets the board gets turned into a hangman. But as you say, there's this sense that there are all these other brothels. It's
Mm.
just everything's going to continue.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and just to jump, sorry, on the thing you said
Yeah.
earlier, you said something very interesting about how the question of what Claudio at the end still, that Isabella's still believing him to be dead, what the point of that might be. Can I speak to that, or does that put us out?
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I find the final scene interesting from the Duke, because in terms of the play just solving its own problems, there's a sense that that whole final scene is a hypothetical. What if Isabella had had sex with Angelo and the Duke hadn't intervened? What it would look like. And it shows the fact that Isabella would speak out about Angelo's abuses of his authority, and no one would believe her, and
Yeah.
she'd be sent off to prison. And for speaking ill of a ruler, and Claudio would still be dead. And it gives us that version of reality that's a really bleak version of kind of the disempowerment of female speech and the state corruption. And it says, but it's okay because the Duke was spying on everything and
Mm.
knows the truth, and then we'll reveal it all and we'll solve it. And that's such a bleak vision of government and of that world.
Mm.
Because what about all the people who weren't being spied on by the
Yes.
Duke?
Yes.
What about
Yes,
the other
absolutely.
places?
Yeah. And do you think, I mean, famously, the play ends with this silence, with an unanswered question. The Duke, as part of this um, serial sort of sentence of marriage to everybody, uh, offers marriage, or offers, I don't know if that's quite the right verb, proposes marriage to Isabella, and she doesn't reply.
Yeah.
Um, that's been a real, um, hasn't it? That's been one of the great sort of interpretive moments in all of Shakespeare, because what's possible in that moment has changed entirely over time. I think for decades, for centuries, it seemed impossible that Isabella would reject. I mean, who wouldn't want to be married to the Duke? Was the sort of, that's Cinderella, or that's every sort of uh, uh, romantic heroine's dreams. And then I guess that's really changed, hasn't it? I
Yeah.
can't think when I last saw a production. It might have been the BBC Shakespeare, those TV ones done in the mostly in the 1980s. If anyone sees those, I think that's the last I've seen, where uh, Isabella accepts the Duke and is really everybody's very happy about everything, and
Yeah.
it's a great happy ending. I
Yes.
don't think that doesn't seem available to us now, I don't think.
Although it's interesting, I think there was I think the Globe on Screen production from, was it 2015 or whenever it was?
Mhm.
I think in that one, there's the, it's not, as you say, it can't, it's not available to us to have an absolutely straightforward happy ending,
Mm.
rom-com happy ending anymore. But I think that one, she was sort of shocked that she did dance with him. There was this
Right.
sense of there was a choosing by her. She
Mhm.
put out her hand, or I'm trying to remember it exactly, or she
Mhm.
stepped forward. But I think there had to be tears as well.
Mhm.
It had to be a mixed emotion. But I agree, the majority of productions now take that moment as a scream, as a turning away, as a horror struck look, as a
Yes, as a,
thought.
it's closed in on us.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
there isn't an option. I
yeah.
remember you mentioned the Cheek by Jowl production. I feel as if that was one which, where the downstage opened into this big louche bed, and he just sort of nods to it, and you think, yeah, she's still trapped.
Yeah,
I've always loved those sort of readings which have the Duke and Angelo as a sort of Jekyll and Hyde, two
yeah.
sides of the same person, really, or that there isn't an alternative. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's interesting in terms of the all the sort of 20th century criticism that, as you said, disliked Isabella so much. So much of that also revered the Duke as this God figure, this Christ figure, an author figure. And then I agree, we've sort of gradually, especially both in criticism and in productions, it's become more and more visible his instability as a sort of a heroic figure, the fact that every choice he makes, even if it seems to be for the good of the characters we care about,
Mm.
is done in an underhand or manipulative or discomforting way.
What do you think about the disguise as a friar? So we already talked a bit about sort of trying to rehabilitate a more positive connotation for the convent and for Isabella's choice.
Yeah.
But a bit like I'm still thinking about what you said earlier on, which was such a great way of putting it, that we every time there's a possibility of empathy, it's sort of taken away. And somehow this something similar happens by having the Duke dress up as a friar, sort of immediately takes back any sort of spiritual, religious sort of confidence we might have in these institutions. They seem like costumes to be sort of put on or taken off.
Absolutely. And I feel that's been, you asked it earlier about the comedy. I feel that's a moment that in productions is often very funny, are the sort of moments when someone's turning to the Duke to say, give their confession. He's counseling Juliet, who's, heavily pregnant, very near her time, and
Mm,
is learning that she knows that she and Claudio are imprisoned, and instead of giving her religious comfort, he accidentally reveals to her that Claudio is going to be executed.
mm,
This sort of, all the moments where he's supposed to be comforting Claudio or supposed to be persuading Barnardine as another criminal to die, and Barnardine resists
mm,
him. All these moments are moments that could provide a moment of hope or
mm,
religious consolation, and instead, because he's impersonating a friar and isn't very good at it, they kind of pathetically undercut
mm,
that. And I suppose, like Isabella's vocation, it sort of raises the question of how seriously do we take Catholic faith in the play? Is it, I mean, impersonating a priest isn't a good thing to do for a ruler or anyone to do in any religious system. Does the fact that it's a Catholic friar help
mm,
the audience
mm,
sort of accept it as if friars are corrupt anyway in the
mm.
Protestant worldview? Does that make
Yes.
it allowable? It's, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And that makes me think about one character we haven't even mentioned.
Mm.
I wonder if does Mariana get a better does she get the better end, as it were, of the Duke? No bawdy pun intended. I mean, does she? Is it in relation to her that he has somehow? I mean, this is a way with the plays sort of timescales, as so often with Shakespeare, sort of fall away, don't they? That somehow there's a sense this friar has been counselling Mariana for many years, and
Yes.
then but this is all sort of this is double time or whatever. But is he? Is he at his best in that situation? Not really, is he?
Well, I think you're right. That's one of the play's more interesting or most interesting puzzles of sort of the question of how has the friar been providing religious consolation for Mariana in a way that's set up as genuine? You know, she seems to genuinely find comfort. Has the Duke disguised himself as a friar before? Is that question right? Does he go round? Has this always been part of his mode of governance, is to use or abuse priestly authority as a way of finding out what's really going on with his subjects? And I mean, on the one hand, he gets her the husband she wants and then agrees not to execute him. And he enables the broken contract because, of course, she's contracted to Angelo. But Angelo, in the past, before the play has begun, has broken that contract when she lost her dowry through her brother's death. So another interesting brother-sister there. that's also something the play is playing with. But there's the fact that the Duke is being genuinely helpful to her in terms of her stated desires and are genuinely sort of sympathetic to her distress as well. But at the same time, he's always known that Angelo wrongly broke a contract of marriage. He still makes Angelo his substitute. That doesn't stop him from giving Angelo enormous power, despite knowing that his sort of perfect image is hiding something tarnished. And he doesn't use legitimate channels to bring about the marriage. He enforces the bed trick, which is, of course, one of the most problematic elements of the problem play, where Angelo doesn't know he's having sex with Mariana. So it's, in a sense, a rape by Mariana of Angelo because he thinks he's having sex with Isabella, which would itself, in a sense, be a rape. So it's a very discomforting moment of sort of measure for measure. So it feels like the Duke's methods are so dubious there that, yes, the outcome he's offering Mariana is probably the best of the outcomes, but it's again a question of, do the ends justify the means?
There's loads I want to ask you, but let's just spend a minute on the slide, the speech that you the sort of scene that you wanted us just to talk through, and then let's move to some questions. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that right? Is that
we can see the top of the speech, but not the entire thing at the moment.
And can we see it all now?
Yes, we can see it all now.
And let's go from the start. Brilliant.
Oh yes.
So this is Isabella's interview with Angelo, the first time they meet, isn't it? Tell us about why you chose this moment.
Yeah, so I mean, I found it really hard to narrow down a moment to talk about, but I felt this one, it tells us so much about the play because it's a moment where Isabella is pleading with Angelo for mercy for her brother. And of course, the language of justice versus mercy and redemption, it's the kind of the biblical context of the title, Measure for Measure, and the Sermon on the Mount. And then it's also just the kind of key question that the play is posing. But this is the moment where Angelo seems to be affected by Isabella. He begins to desire her because of the sense she is speaking, and he's going to get a soliloquy telling us that he desires her and blaming her for it. So this seems to be the moment where it's sort of the inciting incident, as it were, for their relationship, where she thinks what she's doing is speaking persuasively to plead for her brother, but Angelo is interpreting her eloquence very differently. It's also the moment where Lucio is prompting Isabella to behave in a particular way, to sort of use her womanly wiles, it's implied, in order to convince Angelo. And she's using her eloquence, but he is trying to get her to be more emotive, more sort of, I suppose, stereotypically feminine, according to the ideas of the time. He says to her, "You are too cold." He wants her to be kind of warmer in how she presents things. And he has the line, "I touch him, there's the vein," which actually I'd always read as metaphorical, sort of touch him emotionally. But my students always point that out as a moment that he touches her. And I thought, well, that's equally valid as a reading. So, a moment that she touches him, rather. So a moment of physical touch that, in terms of these ideas of plague and proximity and danger, that incites his desire. But there's also something very discomforting about the queasiness of this brothel-going man prompting this novice nun on how to persuade a man. There's also the fact that he's speaking to her in asides, so the audience hears it, but Angelo doesn't. And it's a play where, even for Shakespeare, I feel there's a lot of disguise, asides. Not everyone has all the information, but the audience sees it all. And it's also a moment where Isabella, the way she tries to convince Angelo is to try and get him to step into other people's shoes and is to wish that she could be in his position. So she sort of tries to make him imagine slipping like Claudio. And then she also says, I would to God I had your potency and you were Isabel, should it then be thus? No, I would tell you what 'twere to be a judge and what a prisoner. So she's sort of trying to get them to imaginatively step into each other's spaces. And I feel it's a very meta-theatrical moment in a play that's not usually discussed as a meta-theatrical play.
That's so great. So when you began by saying it's a play about substitution and
Yeah.
you were thinking about that at a plot level, and the
Mm.
bed trick that you just touched on is often, the sort of most extreme example.
Yes.
I like that what you're pointing out about here is that there are sort of rhetorical or hypothetical substitutions which are part of um, encouraging somebody to empathy.
Yeah.
Imagine what it would be like if it were you, or what would you want to happen.
Yeah.
Um, and it's a great way. It, it it's a lovely moment, I think, when getting to know a Shakespeare play. Perhaps this is true of other texts too, but when you can sort of see at the sentence level something which is you can also see at the level of the plot. You can
Yeah.
see these same things at different sort of on different scales. That feels a really often a really brilliant moment, and it's why we want, even just very briefly, just to look at a very particular moment rather than just talk in general.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, and I think that way of putting it, that it's a sentence level manifestation of the wider concerns of the play is really good. Also, I couldn't tell if my toddler was just attempting to enter the room and howling outside the door. So apologies if you all heard that. I don't know if the microphones were picking it up.
We're all looking forward to that great television moment where some child came in. It was a very good moment. Well,
Yeah.
we're just on the slides just for a second. I'm just going to hold you, Emma. This is just to give a sort of heads up for people about what's coming. So Richard II is next in February. We go through Cymbeline, two parts of Henry VI, Arden of Faversham. And then we have our summer break, Winter's Tale, Richard III, Pericles, and Midsummer Night's Dream. So I'm going to stop there. Emma, that's been fabulous. Let me think just a little bit about the questions that people are asking about. Okay, so we've got a few about disguise. Um, Edel, hi, it's good to see you. I says, can you say a bit more about the Duke being in disguise, other disguised Duke plays around the same time, a hands-on, intimate way of shaping the intimate lives of his subjects. Um, and maybe relating to this is a really nice question from Sarah Spring. Thank you. What do you make of the Duke's use of trochaic tetrameter? So short rhythmic lines in a soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 2. She points out the verse form is usually reserved for supernatural characters, which is a great observation. So it's the same. When shall we three meet again?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that same. So there's a linguistic disguise maybe here, which just seemed really interesting. And then I think I saw maybe it was you, James. Nice to see you also saying, does disguising yourself as a monk act as a comic device? There will be some religious, religiously well informed people who will say it's not a monk, it's a friar. Uh, so Isabella wants to be in a convent, which is a place, but the Duke wants to be a friar, which is a vocation
Yeah.
out in the world. It's a different kind of spirituality, I think. But it gives the Duke spiritual status, but no temporal status. How does he expect anyone disguised as a friar to be able to shape government? Interesting. Anything you wanted to say about anything more about the other disguised plays, or
So yeah, I think
because
there's a
they're
mouth.
usually put, aren't they, with the new
Yeah,
king, the new King
yeah,
James. Mm.
yeah. I mean, I think yeah, for me, I was reading it in terms of, and following many brilliant critics in doing this, in terms of this idea of the new king and the plague delaying his coronation, and also the fact that he wasn't into public pageantry in the same way that Elizabeth was. He was much more retiring in his mode of kingship. So the sense of an unknown king, of a king the populace didn't know, and the anxieties about that being sort of expressed via the figure of the disguised duke, the disguised ruler who spies on and manipulates his subjects. And I think a lot of people again have kind of written about this, the fact that the duke more than once, both in attempting to set up his disguise and when he's alone with the audience, talks about disliking the public gaze, which is that's a touch that's not necessary to the disguised duke plot. That's a decision by Shakespeare to add that, to make him very explicitly James-like in his unwillingness to be sort of seen and crowded. And Angelo, again at that kind of one of those sentence level moments, Angelo at one point uses the metaphor of his heart and nerves are sort of feeling like the moment when someone swoons and a crowd, the foolish throngs come around them, and therefore they can't breathe because there are too many people. So he's a very claustrophobic ruler. It's a very claustrophobic play. And I think that's definitely a decision by Shakespeare to sort of comment almost within the play on this disguised ruler trope, on this idea of a ruler at once exercising power wrongly because he's not seen and known, and as a kind of private person disliking the public elements of his power. But I also think it's something that Shakespeare's been interested in for a longer time, because it comes up with Richard II as well, this sort of, and then Bolingbroke sort of talking about, is a good king someone who is seen a lot and very known, or does that sort of make him too familiar to his subjects? And so I think that's a question that Shakespeare's kind of speaking to as well.
Yeah, and we talked a bit about that in the webinar on Henry IV Part One with Indira Ghosh, where we talked about how the old King Henry IV is advising the prince to be less visible, and to be not to cheapen himself through that.
Yeah.
That's interesting that you went in that direction, Emma, because quite a lot of questions here. People are obviously interested in um, the sort of almost capital P politics of the play. So Mark Prothero says the root cause of the tribulations in the play is the Duke's unwise abdication of authority. It's a really great statement, Mark. It would be really good to debate whether that's actually true, but it's a lovely sort of proposition. Does this link to later tragedies like Lear and Macbeth? Laurie Higgins, do you think this play is representing how powerful individuals wield politics as a vessel for their individual desire, or how individuals will always merely be a vessel through which politics is or power is exercised? Is Shakespeare placing the blame on the self or the system? Um, and then
Oh,
one
brilliant.
more. These are all sort of connected. Kibria Nasir, thanks for your question. You mentioned whether Measure for Measure is ultimately concerned with how far the state can intervene in intimate relationships. I wondered whether the play deliberately exposes the danger of institutional authority regulating bodily and private decisions, especially those that disproportionately affect women, which may explain its continued contemporary resonance. Yeah, very, very nicely put indeed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. The play is kind of, in a sense, about the limits of state authority, and I suppose in the period as well, the home is becoming an increasingly private space. The idea of an Englishman's home as his castle is sort of emerging, and so in relation to that, there's a very kind of live question about can the tendrils of the state kind of go into that castle, or can it be kept sort of private and absolutely ruled over by the kind of husband father figure? But I think that's an interesting question as well about this. Is the system at fault? Is the individual at fault? And I mean, state power acts on the Duke and Angelo in very different ways, and they act on it and within it in almost diametrically opposed ways, because one abuses their authority, the other fails to exercise their authority and then uses it differently, not using the channels of state power until right at the end. But I guess they both suggest the potential for the system of state power where it rests on a single individual to be abused and misused. But yeah, what do you think, Emma?
Yeah, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about how interestingly Shakespeare's comedies sort of nestle in with these apparently private domestic issues about marriage and mistake, disguised mistaken identity and so on. And yet, and their relation to the larger political sphere, it is left a little bit opaque. It's quite odd to think why there is a completely alienated duke in the forest in As You Like It, for instance. I mean, why has there been this background of usurpation? Sort of what relationship is that supposed to have to the romantic comedy of the play? It's more than we need as a
Yeah.
I hadn't really sort of thought that so much about Measure for Measure until we were talking now. It reminds me that I think Diana asked about, and it's maybe related, Barnardine.
Yes.
What's your take on his character? Does Shakespeare use him as a model of how to overthrow power or to make a mockery of the whole idea of justice? I mean, as you mentioned, so Barnardine is um, uh, the resistance, isn't he, to this model of substitution? He says, I know what you want to do. You want to execute me instead of Claudio. But I mean, he doesn't exactly know that, but somehow, at some level in the play, he says, "You want me to be a plot device so that I can be substituted, and I'm the one person in this play who refuses the substitution.
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
just not going to do it. I'm not ready." But he doesn't have a good reason for it, does he? He just says, "I'm too drunk," which is
Yeah.
a great reason not to be executed.
Yes. And yeah, and I think I suppose it's a kind of it's the other side, the other sort of bookend, as it were, of the elbow scene, in that it's just a moment where this is a play about authority, about government, politics with a capital P, it seems, and yet authority is sort of failing at every level. The sort of the inability to govern, Angelo's inability to govern in the courtroom, the Duke and the officer's inability to govern Barnardine and get him to behave in order to be executed. Those are sort of the two comic moments where this whole system that's talked about in these sort of kind of grandstanding terms elsewhere, it kind of collapses and falls down. And yeah, I find it a really interesting moment because the Duke is pulling so many strings and manipulating so many people, and then he just hits this wall. And then when Ragozine, the pirate Ragozine, dies in prison and therefore his head is available for substitution, there's this sort of sense that, and the Duke has that line, it is an accident that heaven provides, or I think in this version, because the presumably original choice to have God there rather than heaven has been substituted, and that was kind of Terry's choice, that it is an accident that God provides. That sort of calls into question the fact that, well, if God could bring about the narrative design that enables Claudio to be saved, then why didn't he do it via Barnardine? It's this sort of moment that it's almost like a nod and a wink by Shakespeare about the impossibility of corralling these characters into the correct narrative patterns. And so, yeah, I don't have a kind of a single coherent way to explain Barnardine, but I just find him really interesting as an obstruction to will, to political authority, to narrative, to providence, in just his general refusal. But it does also help ensure that the play doesn't have deaths of the characters we meet. Yeah. So it's kind of also maybe a moment of reinforcing this is a comedy, remember, we're not actually going to kill anyone off.
Yeah, yeah. And the Duke pardons Barnardine at the end, doesn't he? And that either that is, depending on how you see it, an act of great mercy or a kind of an inability to enforce legal norms, and also a kind of continued rule by personal fiat, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of outside the legal system. There's a few more I want to get to. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all the questions, I think. But Jay, I wanted to get yours because you, like Emma, some time ago, are doing Measure for Measure for A level. And you've got a really good question about the very beginning of the play. Why does the Duke choose Angelo over Aeschylus, who seems to be the perfect candidate. I've seen it performed with you where Aeschylus is listening to the Duke, talking to him and sort of thinking, oh, he's about to promote me. And then Angelo, what
Yeah.
what do you think about why that is?
Really interesting question. I always think about those lines where the Duke says after appointing Angelo, thus we shall see if power change purpose, what our seemers be. And that it isn't necessarily entirely consistent with everything else, but it seems to be a moment that suggests that the whole thing is a test for Angelo, which, it does call into question, is this really you trying to govern well, Duke? Is this you abdicating responsibility to try and get your state in order? Or is this just you putting a whole country through something, a whole realm through something in order to test one man? But that seems to be a moment where the suggestion is he doesn't want to test Aeschylus. It's Angelo who's held up as this paragon of virtue, who's supposed to be unmoved by desire, whose blood is very snow broth, this kind of cold, frozen, perfectly good man. Angel is in his name. And the Duke wants to see if he will remain angelic or if he will fall. And so I think that's why. But it's an interesting puzzle.
That's really great. And there's one area I do want us to touch on, which we haven't done, and I want to do this maybe via Laurie Higgins. Given its focus on disguise, urban disorder, and morality, could we consider the play as Johnsonian in part? And then I think Sarah Spring, again, I think I noticed that you asked why are the names Italian when it's set in Vienna. And I wondered if that might give us a chance to talk a bit about the Middletonness. Because I
Yeah.
suppose what has changed about um, maybe the New Oxford Shakespeare, the sort of mothership that we are, the Reverend Mother to which we are the novices. The New Oxford Shakespeare's big thing has been developing a sense, an extended sense of the way in which Shakespeare's plays are collaboratively written.
Yeah.
And those collaborations might be different authors working at the same time. And we'll come to that when we have the webinars later this year on Henry VI, parts 1 and 2. That's going to be a big part of our conversation. Some plays where perhaps there's a later rewrite over on top of a Shakespeare play. We touched on that in my conversation about Macbeth, but not so much, although that's one play where it's thought about. But here, Measure for Measure feels like a play which has changed its character a little bit because of the idea that the play as we have it is a post Shakespeare, although pre 1623 when it's first published. Remember, Shakespeare dies in 1616. Version of the play by Thomas Middleton with more or less Middleton, depending. I mean, that's a kind of it's an unknowable, isn't it? We don't have the Shakespeare pre-Middleton, but we have this one. Do you want to say anything about, what to do with that, or whether that's even sort of relevant if we're sort of reading the play and thinking about the questions we've been thinking about?
Yeah, I find it both really interesting and really tricky because of the difficulty of making any sort of argument about that fact because one can't be precise. So the lack of you cannot pinpoint the moments because we don't know what the underlying version might have been. So I always find it difficult to talk about, but I think it's so important because I'm a big Middleton fan, full disclosure, and I feel, and so maybe that's why I love Measure for Measure so much as well. I feel the grubbiness and the moral, the kind of, maybe not just Shakespeare also obviously is interested in moral dilemmas, but I feel the disconcertingness of the moral dilemmas does feel very recognizably Middletonian. The bleakness of the view of humanity.
There's a lot of sex in Middleton comedies, isn't there? Not much sex in
Yeah.
Shakespeare's comedies.
Yeah. The language around sex, the fact that as you pointed out, that we don't necessarily particularly like any of the characters, which feels quite Middletonian and also Johnsonian. I agree. Yeah, so I think there's definitely something recognizable there about how Middleton paints a world. I suppose the amount not just the, as you say, the amount of sex, definitely, but also the extent to which sex is such a plot point. I feel I'm thinking of things like Women Beware Women, except I suppose in Middleton, I feel like the female characters do have sex outside of marriage. And I find it quite interesting that Shakespeare's quite carefully guarding the chastity of his female characters
Yeah.
in the world that's so attached to the ideal of female chastity, because Mariana has the bed trick, but she's already
Yes.
pre-contracted, so that's okay.
And she's been in a moated grange, hasn't she,
Yes,
forever? So nobody could have got at her since then.
sequestered.
Yeah.
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 And
Yeah.
Juliet and Claudio, they are really sort of married in social terms,
Yes.
not in religious terms. And Isabella, of course, if he followed his sources, she would have had sex or, been raped, depending on how you want to
Yeah.
construct that. But she just doesn't. Her virginity is preserved. And I think that's really interesting. And that feels Shakespearean to me. That reminds me of Much Ado and Hero, and or Othello,
Yeah.
all the kind of besmirched reputations of these virginal Shakespearean heroines. So I think
That's interesting. It gives me just a minute to touch on Lynn Frice's question, which is just asking how familiar do we think audiences would have been with other versions of this story? It's a great question, Lynn, because it, sometimes we talk about Shakespeare sources as if they're just sources for him in his writing process, however we imagine that. But it's interesting when they could also be seen as sources for the audience
yeah,
in horizons of expectation, as critics might put it,
yeah.
that then people audiences would feel, oh, that wasn't what I was expecting, or that wasn't how it was last time I saw it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the and the two of the sources here are kind of Cynthia's prose version of the tale and the play Promise and Cassandra by Whetstone. And sorry, I wrote this introduction a while ago, so I'm hoping I have reread it today. I'm
Yeah.
hoping all those details correct. But in the play, and the Isabella figure marries the Angelo figure, and
Yeah.
that's I think in the Cynthia version, the Claudio figure is a rapist.
Yeah.
Sex with Juliet isn't consensual. So there are some key things there that audience members might expect. And I think particularly the Duke's proposal, the fact that Angelo then marries Mariana and the Duke's proposal, I think that would have been a moment of narrative surprise for anyone familiar with any of the versions of the story that have come up to this point. And yes, I found that really interesting when I realized that, because that suggests that Isabella's silence isn't just a modern obsession or even a 19th, 20th century. It suggests that back in Shakespeare's time, the way that moment is set up, it would have been a huge narrative twist comparable to the moment in King Lear, where if people only knew the source King Lear play, they would expect a happy ending, and then it suddenly turned to tragedy. It's that kind of moment. So the silence would have been so noticeable then.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. We are coming, I think, to a conclusion. I think we're just about at time. What I'm going to ask you, Emma, if you can think of something, is what you might recommend to anybody who's inspired by this discussion. We would say go and get the Oxford World Classics edition and read Emma's introduction. But is there something else that you would then recommend? And I'll just give you a minute to do that while I just say, somebody asked whether there was going to be a webinar on Twelfth Night. There will be, but there is not yet an Oxford World Classics edition of Twelfth Night. That's in process. Simone Chess is writing that introduction. So that's not going to be until, I think, the end of our time. We're about a quarter of the way through Shakespeare's works. So buckle in, because we're here till 2030, more or less 2030, I think, 2029 at least. Thanks for the questions that and I'm sorry about things we haven't had a chance to answer. If you want to be in touch with me with a question that hasn't been answered, I'm always happy to have a go afterwards, but I don't commit our guests to that. So you can get me Emma Smith at Oxford. So Emma,
Yeah,
last thing, any suggestions? What would you suggest to people who want to take this further?
So I mean, yeah, if you do choose to get hold of the edition, there is a list of further reading because I'm finding it hard to choose just one. So do take a look at that. But the one that came to my mind as a kind of great next step is Kate Chedzoy's Measure for Measure from the Writers and Their Work series. It's from 2000, and it is just a really brilliant sort of explorations of all the things we've been talking about to do with the thorniness of the play, those kind of really uncomfortable, discomforting bits. She sort of really gets into those. So I'd say that's where I go next. But also, if you can find a way to watch the Cheek by Jowl production that we talked about a couple of times, it is, I think that there was a streaming of it at the time, and it's very brilliant as well as an interpretation of it. It certainly shaped the way I think about the play.
Perfect. That's been brilliant. Emma, thank you ever so much. I could have talked to you all evening about this play, which is precisely why I was so glad that you wrote the introduction. We'll really look forward to your book on non-normative families and to what comes next for you. Thanks everybody for being with us. And our next webinar live first Monday in February is on Richard II. So get reading. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.